figuratively. The figurative simile theory and the pragmatic theory. Similes are often, perhaps usually, figures of speech. Example: Sally is only figuratively like a block of ice, for she is only figuratively hard and cold. Literal similarity is symmetric. If A is literally similar to B, then necessarily B is literally similar to A. But a block of ice is not literally like Sally. This suggests the hypothesis that a metaphor is just an abbreviated figurative simile deriving from the corresponding simile taken figuratively. This figurative theory easily sidesteps out three objections to the naive theory. First objection: since the figurative theories does not reduce metaphors to literal and near-trivial assertions of similarity, it cannot be said that the figurative theory treats the metaphor's conceptual tension as superficial. There is already conceptual tension in the underlying simile. Second objection: taken figuratively, the simile already carries one or more particular respects of similarity, so it does not fail to explain how the metaphor brings out those same respects. Third objection: of course, the figurative theorist is not committed to literal similarities between Juliet and the sun, Sally and a block of ice, or Simon and a rock. These three advantages come out an obvious price. Vaugeline, 1988, exploits the notion of a salient feature of a thing. In that way, he is able to mobilize a non-symmetrical similarity relation. A is similar to B if and only if A has a sufficient number of B's salient features. A may share a sufficient number of B's salient feature without B sharing a sufficient number of A's salient features, since the particular features of B that A shares need to be salient in A. For example, a chipmunk is very like a rat, except for being cute or perceived as such by humans. It has most of the rat's salient features, being a small scavenging rodent of loose morals. But one would not to say that a rat is like a chipmunk, because the cuteness of chipmunks is highly salient to humans and rats are not cute. According to Vaugeline, the difference between a figurative comparison and a literal one is in the standard of salience, which in a way reverses. It is, Vaugeline says, literally true that Winston Churchill looked like a bulldog, but literally false that Churchill was like a bulldog, he having human rather than canine, two-legged, lacking in fur, given to talking rather than barking, and far too big to crawl into a doghouse. Unfortunately, Vaugeline does not go into the detail about trimming the feature space. On this view, sentences have metaphorical meanings in context that differ from their literal meanings. Yet it does not follow that any expression in the sentence has changed its meaning from literal to figurative use, or that the metaphorical meanings are spooky or magical. Rather, resemblance is always and everywhere relative to a standard of similarity, a future space that determines which properties are to be matched with which. However, Vaugeline faces at least three more difficulties. First, a statement may continue to be accepted as metaphorically true even when the corresponding simile has proved to be false. Searle offers the example, Richard is gorilla, which the naive simile theory would parse as Richard is like gorilla. Let us suppose that what is meant is that Richard is like a gorilla in being fierce, nasty, prone to violence, and perhaps not very bright. But primatologists tell us that in fact, gorillas are not nasty or prone to violence. They are shy, rather sensitive, and very intelligent animals. Second, consider that many sentences individually admit of either literal or metaphorical interpretation. Adolf is a butcher. The woman has turned. Even when a sentence seems anomalous, often we can imagine circumstances in which it would be literally true. "You are pigs" would have been literally true if addressed by Odysseus to his men in Circe's palace. The third new objection is that some metaphorical statements are too convoluted to be parsed as similes. It is not literally but anyone's blood, and blood cannot literally burn while still within the body under even faintly normal conditions. The soul is probably itself being used metaphorically, and even if not, souls cannot literally lend anything to tongues, but tongues is not being used to mean tongues either, and vowels are not the sort of things that can be lent. The pragmatic theory. Unlike the causal view, the naive simile theory supplied a notion of metaphorical meaning. Sentences had metaphorical meanings in addition to their literal ones, even though the former meanings proved to be shallow and unsatisfactory. Davidson argued globally against metaphorical meaning. Indeed, seems to enact a scorched earth policy, so we should address his arguments. He gives 5 or 6, but the 2 that I take to be most pertinent as directed against the other theories discussed here. First, there are no instructions for devising metaphors. There is manual for determining what a metaphor means or says. There is no test for metaphor that does not call for taste. Second, it is almost universally conceded that although some metaphors can be paraphrased in literal terms without great loss, many are open-ended in the relevant set of similarities is vague and indefinite, and some cannot be paraphrased at all. Now, Davidson's attack on metaphorical meaning can be exaggerated, as it is in spots by his own rhetoric. As I said, it is presented as a scorched earth or zero-tolerance policy, but in fact Davidson concentrates his critical arguments on the idea that linguistic expressions change their meanings in metaphorical usage. And at one important point he is careful not to deny that there is such a thing as metaphorical truth, only to deny it of sentences. This leaves open the possibility that there is a middle way or compromises position. Searle proposes an account of metaphor that joins Davidson in deflating metaphorical meaning, even further that the naive theory and in rejecting a linguistic ambiguity view. But as against Davidson, it takes seriously the idea that metaphorical utterance is genuinely linguistic communication rather than mere causation, and it poses a cognitive mechanism that computes something well worth calling metaphorical meaning. Searle view the pragmatic theory as simply a species of variation or relevance with theoretic communication. Searle has offered a conservative account of how indirect speech acts are performed and understood. The speaker utters a sentence grammatically marked for one range of illocutionary force, but primarily means something by it that has a different force or at least a characteristically different locutionary content. The hearer first uses Grecian reasoning to determine that the speaker is trying to convey something other than what her or his sentence literally means. According to Searle, the problem of explaining how metaphors work is a special case of the general problem of explaining how speaker meaning and sentence or word meaning come apart. Our task in constructing a theory of metaphor is to try to state the principles which relate literal sentence meaning to a metaphorical utterance meaning. Searle breaks down the interpretive process into three steps, parallel to the process he had posited for the interpretation of indirect speech acts. First, the hearer must determine whether to look for a non-literal interpretation in the first place. Second, if the hearer has decided to seek a metaphorical interpretation, she or he must then mobilize some set of principles or strategies for generating a range of possible speaker meanings. Third, she or he must employ a further set of principles or strategies for identifying which meaning or meaning from among that range are most likely to be in play on the present occasion. The obvious strategy underlying the first step is gradation, when an utterance would be obviously defective if taken literally. Look for a different speaker meaning. The gradation strategy is not the only first step option. Some metaphorical utterances are not in any way defective. There are no other contextual cues such as the kind of discourse that is taking place. The principal general strategy for the second step, Searle unsurprisingly says, is to look for similarities or comparisons. Searle mentions just one strategy for the third step, to consider which of the meaning candidates are likely or even possible features of the subject under discussion. There remains the task of distinguishing metaphor as a species of indirect communication from the others such as ordinary implicature, irony, and what Searle calls indirect speech acts proper. The utterance taken literally is defective in that either the opposite is clearly true or the speaker may be expected to believe the opposite. So, the natural choice of indirect meaning is just the opposite. Davidson added the qualification, no test for metaphor that does not call for taste. Very likely, Searle would concede that point, since he makes no claim to completeness and does not predict that even a final set of principles will give perfectly determinate results, but wins these rounds on points. Davidson's second appeal was to open-endedness, unparaphrasability, and downright non-proportionality. Searle's account predict open-endedness, since we may expect that his second and third stages will often fail to tamp down the possible speaker meanings to just one or two. As for unparaphrasability, Searle grants that often we use metaphor precisely because there is no handy and accessible literal expression that means the same thing. But he argues that if something is a linguistic meaning at all, in principle it could be formulated however cumbersomely, in some language or other. Thus, each view has at least one advantage over the other. I believe that a rapprochement is possible, a hybrid view that combines the advantages of the causal theory and the pragmatic theory, and merely note two further objections made against Searle. First, Cooper 1986 and Moran 1997 point out that if metaphorical meaning is simply speaker meaning, then it is determined by and confined to the speaker's intentions. Second, Rose 1981 and Kitay 1987 call our attention to a class of metaphor phenomena, sometimes called analogical, that indisputably involve meaning and meaning but are addressed neither by Davidson's view nor by Searle's. And that ends my discussion. Thank you very much for listening.
Metaphor as analogical. We use metaphor in our daily lives, but we do not actually, or we are not actually aware of them. Let us look at the example. When asked to dust the furniture, she uses a powder puff to spread face powder on the furniture. When required to draw the curtains, she produces a sketch of them, and when asked to dress the chicken, she puts a miniature pair of trousers and shirt on a bird intended for that night's dinner. A person with the command of the language knows that dust the furniture means to remove the dust, draw the curtains means to let the air or to set it aside to let the air or the sunlight in, and dress the chicken means to clean the chicken and remove the feathers and things like that so we can prepare it for a meal. However, the